Welcome back, class. This is a redo of a previous lecture that had a sound issue. We'll be talking about Gestalt psychology. Gestalt psychology, looking at previous views. Well, we're going to examine Titchener and the empirics, where they saw individual sensations become associated through what they refer to as laws of association. Wundt and Kantianism says the mind's inherent organizing power provides structure to our sensations. Opposed to that, we see the Gestalt's view of experience. We experience wholes or overall patterns, not individual parts or sensations, or these discrete elements as proposed by the previous philosophers in psychology. So, Gestalt revolution occurred in Germany. It was very much a protest against the Wundtian ideas and views. So this anti-Wundt approach was against elementism, the organization of elements. Perception of objects is a summation of elements, but the whole is different from the sum of its parts. That was the Gestalt perspective of this. We don't break these things down. We don't add them up to make sense or perceive things. That sometimes when we have these individual elements, these discrete elements in the environment, what we perceive from that is greater than the sum. So it accepts the value of consciousness, unlike behaviorists, which were not interested, as you know, with consciousness at all. They were very much an objective group. So we look at some of the antecedents, some of the influences on Gestalt psychology. Start with Immanuel Kant. Elements are organized meaningfully, not via association. Franz Brentano. Psychology should examine the act of experiencing. Okay, discounted introspection as being artificial. Ernst Mach, experiencing relations of stimuli, not reality. We see, for example, the idea of illusions. Sometimes we will perceive certain things which are not actually there. So an optical illusion exaggerates the contrast between the edges of the slightly different shades of gray in the image here. And we see them as being very distinct from one another, even though that's not what's actually there. Von Ehrenfels, the combination of elementary sensations do not explain qualities of experience. Again, the idea with Ehrenfels is suggested here is that perceptions are greater than simply just adding up the individual sensations that we are experiencing. Then we have William James. The elements of consciousness are artificial abstractions. The mind perceives the whole. Phenomenology, unbiased perception of immediate experience, not reduced to elements. See Stump, the whole of immediate experience as the basic data of study. And physics influence. Physicists starting to think in terms of fields and organic wholes. Gestalt psychology could be seen as applying physics to psychology. So, we're looking at the antecedents, some of the German psychologists versus Wundt, philosophers, Wertheimer, Kafka, Kohler, isomorphism, prognance, the law of prognance, perception, learning, productive thinking, and look at Kurt Lewin's ideas and the impact of Gestalt psychology. So, Gestalt psychology was founded in Germany around 1912. It was seeking to explain perceptions in terms of gestalts rather than by analyzing their constituents. German psychologists took issue with the Wundt's elementism. All right, so several German psychologists argue that consciousness could not be reduced to elements without distorting the true meaning of conscious experience. People experiencing things in meaningful, intact configurations, and that's what is referred to as Gestalt. They advocated a molar approach which concentrates on phenomenological experience, mental experience as it occurred to the naive observer without further analysis. So don't look at breaking these things down, look at the experience itself. So an example of intact meaningful configurations, we have this. According to research at English University, it doesn't matter in what order the letters in a word are. The only important thing is that the first and last letter is at the right place. The rest can be a total mess and you can still read it without a problem. This is because we do not read every letter by itself, but the word as a whole. This is sort of a live example of what we mean by Gestalt. So, looking at some of the other philosophers that were antecedents, we have Immanuel Kant and Gestaltists both believe that consciousness cannot be reduced to sensory stimulation, and conscious experience is different from the elements that compose it. Ernst Mach postulated that two perceptions, space form and time form, appear to be independent of the particular elements that compose them, your sense of space, your sense of time. So, continuing the idea of these antecedents, we look at Christian von Ehrenfels, who influenced Wertheimer, one of the founders of Gestalt psychology, as one of his instructors. Ehrenfels and Mach proposed that form is something that emerges from the elements of sensation. So we have these elements gathered together, okay? But then there's something else that occurs, form, which may not simply be just the addition or the summation of all the sensations that one is experiencing. William James postulated a stream of consciousness in contrast to the mind being composed of isolated mental elements. The stream should be the focus of psychological inquiry. Any attempt to break it up for more detailed analysis must be avoided. Again, lending some support to the ideas that are being offered here by the Gestaltist. So, looking at some of the other antecedents as well, we have ACT psychology, ACT psychology, proposed by Brentano and Stump. ACT psychology is intentionalism, which concerns itself with the mind's acts or processes of perception, judging, loving, hating, rather than with the contents and states of mind. It focuses on the acts of perceiving, sensing, problem solving, had an influence on the Gestaltists. So ACT psychologists and the Gestaltists were both phenomenologists, the philosophical study of the structures of experience and consciousness. All three individuals who are seen as the founders of Gestalt psychology studied under Stump. Kohler was well versed in physics, and Gestalt psychology represented the effort to model psychology after field theory instead of Newtonian physics. Then we introduce the idea of one of the founders of Gestalt psychology, Max Wertheimer. Okay, he used the phi phenomenon, which we'll see in a second here, a perception of apparent movement when the elements of experiences are in fact stationary. We see this every single time we go to a movie or watch television. We perceive movement where in fact there really isn't any. Basically the simple idea is what we see in a movie. We see a bunch of still photographs that are taken, and then they're shown rather rapidly one after the other. Each time the object in the frame is a little bit different location, giving us the perception of movement. So Wertheimer proposed that our perceptions are different than the sensations that comprise them. His paper describing the phenomena is customarily taken as the formal beginning of what we refer to as Gestalt psychology. In addition to presenting the initial ideas of Gestalt psychology, his two research assistants at the time, Kafka and Kohler, were seen as the individuals who were the co-founders of Gestalt psychology. Here's the phi phenomenon. The phi phenomenon is an optical illusion of perceiving series of still images when viewed in rapid succession as continuous movement. He defined this phenomenon in 1912. And we see that this, again, this gives us this overall perception of movement. We can't help ourselves. But in fact, there really isn't any movement there. We are perceiving it. So here are some of the other individuals of the founders of Gestalt psychology. We have Kurt Kafka. He wrote several books and articles on Gestalt. His article, Perception and Introduction to Gestalt Theory, was believed to provide the misrepresentation that Gestaltists were only interested in perception. Okay, and obviously, if you have come across Gestalt psychology, most oftentimes you would have come across them in a sensation class, sensation and perception class, maybe a cognitive psych class, or again, normally in an intro class and the chapter on sensation. We also have Wolfgang Kohler. He did research regarding aspects of learning, which greatly influenced Gestalt ideas, including the nature of learning in chimpanzees. There should be a video on your Canvas site that just goes and shows and demonstrates a chimpanzee in the act of learning. Also an example of insight learning, so to speak. So, field theory, isomorphism and the law of pregnance. Gestalt has proposed that 1. The brain contains structural fields of electrochemical forces. 2. Upon entering a field, sensory data both modify the structure of the field and are modified by the field. And 3. Our experience results from the interaction of the sensory data and the force fields in the brain. The cognitive experience results from the fields of brain activity transforming sensory data and giving the data characteristics it otherwise would not possess. So basically, according to this analysis, the whole exists prior to the parts, and it is the whole that gives the parts their identity and meaning. So as we observe something or sense something, it comes into the fields of the brain, things are done to it and added to it, which again may give some support to the idea that we have this whole perception, which is not exactly equivalent to the individual elements of the sensations that we were sensing previously. So the psychophysical isomorphism. The force fields in the brain transform incoming sensory data, and that is transformed data that we experience consciously. Isomorphism comes from the Greek meaning similar shape. The patterns of the brain activity and the patterns of the conscious experience are structurally equivalent. The brain is a dynamic configuration of forces that transform sensory information. Instead of viewing the brain as a passive receiver and recorder of sensory information, the notion of isomorphism necessitated an opposition to the consistency hypothesis, which states that there's a one-to-one correspondence between environmental stimuli and sensations. So if we say environmental stimuli and sensations are equivalent, okay, then that sort of misses the point from the Gestalting's perspective. So let's look at something that you may be familiar with as well, top-down analysis. For Gestalt psychology, organized brain activity dominates our perception, all right? Not the stimuli that enter into the activity. So the stimuli that enter into the act of perceiving are just there, but we add something else to it. There's something else that goes into our whole perception. So from top-down analysis, if you recall, this gives us sort of a similar type of notion. Therefore, the whole is more important than the parts, thus reversing one of psychology's oldest traditions that we've seen so far in this semester, where they get these individual things that are maybe simple, we put them together to build more complex things, we may perceive these things. So analysis proceeded from the top to the bottom instead, from the bottom to the top. In other words, analysis proceeded from the whole to the parts. That's what top-down analysis speaks to. So let's remember some from your sensation perception class or from a previous class in general psych that covered these topics. But bottom-up processing are sensory analysis that begins at the entry level with information flowing from the sensory receptors to the brain. We're building it up that way. With top-down processing, information processing guided by higher level mental processes, as when we construct perceptions by filtering information through our experience and expectations. So here's some examples. We perceive by filling the gaps in what we sense. I want chocolate ice cream. We fill in the gaps, the missing letters for this particular phrase. Based on our experience and schemas, we look at these photographs. We've seen a bunch of old faces. And so when we see this image, which can go either way, a face or another object, we will tend to see it as a face because of our recent experiences. We've sort of been primed to see a face there. It makes us be able to examine it rather quickly and easily just by our expectation alone. But the same thing can be said this way as well. If we show these images, then it's more likely that we'll see this as a mouse as opposed to a face. So if you see many old men in glasses, you're more apt to process a picture of an old man even when you may be in error. Top-down processing controls what it is that we're going to perceive. We can have a perception that can be either thing here. We can perceive it as an old man or as a mouse. So here the elements can go either way, but the perception is something greater than the elements, obviously, in this instance. So top-down perception is constructed by cognition. Now let's look at the law of prognance. The psychological organization will always be as good as conditions allow, because fields of the brain activity will always distribute themselves in the simplest way possible under the prevailing conditions. So, the law asserts that all cognitive experiences will tend to be as organized, symmetrical, and simple and regular as they can be given the pattern of the brain activity at any given moment. Or you can think of it another way. Your mind wants to make the most meaningful yet easiest interpretation of stimuli that it can make. Your mind wants to make the most meaningful yet easiest interpretation of the stimuli that it can make. The minimum principle of perception. We do not see little mistakes in pictures, sentence structures, etc. We see what we perceive at first glance. So the idea here is that we are sort of pre-designed, pre-programmed to make these particular adjustments to our perception. We make the most meaningful yet easiest interpretation of the stimuli that we can make. And that sort of explains to a large extent what we see when we have these Gestalt